They say the wind in this country has a memory. They say it carries the ghosts of promises broken and debts unpaid. Out on the high plains, where the sun bakes the cracked earth into a mosaic of despair, the wind whispers tales to the sagebrush and the lonely fence posts. It speaks of men who came seeking fortune and found only a grave, and of women who built homes from dust and tears. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the moon is a sliver of bone in the black sky, it whispers the legend of Widow's Pass. It tells of a single man, a blacksmith by trade, who stood alone against the Cutler gang for 2 days and 2 nights. A phantom of iron and wool who held the narrow canyon, allowing the innocent to escape a tide of fire and blood. They say he was a ghost, wreathed in the smoke of his own fury, his hammer falling like judgment. They never found the bodies of the gang, only the shattered rock and splintered wood of their defeat. And the man, the legend, he vanished, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a hammer and a name whispered in awe, the ghost of the pass. Like all ghosts, he was a story meant to fade. But the wind remembers. And in the town of Redemption, a place that had long forgotten its name, the wind was about to blow a ghost back into the world of the living. The man who walked into Redemption did not look like a legend. He looked like a stray dog that had been kicked one too many times. Dust was not on him, but in him, settled deep in the lines of his face and the hollows of his eyes. He moved with a limp that was less a flaw in his gait and more a permanent part of his rhythm, a quiet testament to a pain he no longer acknowledged. His name was Silas, though no one knew it, for he did not speak. His gaze was distant, fixed on a horizon only he could see, a place haunted by smoke and regret. He passed the saloon, its boisterous noise a world away from the silence he carried. He passed the general store, its windows clouded with the town's apathy. He stopped only when he reached the one place that felt like an extension of his own soul, the abandoned blacksmith's forge. It stood at the edge of town, a skeletal ruin of scorched timber and rusted iron, its great stone hearth cold and lightless. He pushed open the groaning door and stepped inside, the darkness wrapping around him like a familiar shroud. He ran a hand over the cold anvil, his fingers tracing the scars and dents like a blind man reading a sacred text. In the thick dust, his touch left a clean, dark line. It was the first mark he had made on the world in a very long time. From her small farmhouse on the rise just beyond the forge, Ilara saw him arrive. She watched him as she had watched everything for the past year, with a weariness that had settled into her bones. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of this parched land, a debt she could not pay, and the 2 small heartbeats that were her reason for drawing breath. Leo, at 10, was a miniature man, his face already set in a permanent frown of responsibility. Maya, at 6, still held the sun in her eyes, a light Ilara fought with every fiber of her being to keep from extinguishing. She wiped her hands on her apron, a gesture so reflexive she no longer noticed it, and looked toward the town road. They were late today, but they would come. They always did. As if summoned by the thought, a cloud of dust appeared on the road. 3 riders. At their head was Jonas, a man whose cruelty was as plain and artless as the cheap tin star he didn't wear but clearly coveted. He was the fist of Bartholomew Thorne, the land baron who was slowly strangling the life out of Redemption, buying up failed farms for pennies on the dollar. Ilara's farm was the last holdout on this side of the valley. Thorne wanted it. Jonas enjoyed the wanting. They reined in their horses, deliberately trampling the small patch of stubborn flowers Maya had planted by the fence. Ilara's jaw tightened, but her face remained a stoic mask. She had learned long ago that any show of emotion was a currency they would gladly spend. Afternoon, widow, Jonas sneered, his eyes roving over her, making her feel as stripped and barren as the land around her. Thorne was asking after his payment. The harvest was poor, Jonas. You know that, she said, her voice steady. Excuses don't fill a man's coffers. He swung down from his horse. He walked over to the 2 barrels of water she had spent the morning hauling from the creek. With a lazy grin, he kicked one over. The precious water sank instantly into the thirsty ground. A dark, wet stain was all that remained. Leo shot out of the house, his small fists clenched. "Leave it alone," he shouted, his voice cracking with a boy's impotent fury. Jonas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He backhanded Leo, not hard, but with enough contempt to send the boy stumbling into the dust. "Get back in the house, pup, before you learn a man's lesson." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. A cold, sharp rage, something she had thought long dead, flared within her. But before she could move, before she could scream, another shadow fell across the yard. It was the stranger from the forge. Silas moved with that same quiet, limping rhythm, his presence sucking the air out of the confrontation. He didn't look at Jonas. He didn't look at his men. He walked directly to the fallen barrel and, with an economy of motion that was almost beautiful, righted it. Then he went to the second barrel and stood beside it, his hand resting lightly on the wooden rim. He still hadn't said a word. Jonas turned, his amusement souring into irritation. "What's this?" The widow got herself a scarecrow. He strode toward Silas, puffing out his chest. "You deaf, old man? Or just stupid?" He shoved Silas in the shoulder. It was like shoving a granite outcrop. Silas didn't move, didn't even sway. He simply lifted his head and looked at Jonas. His eyes were not angry. They were not frightened. They were ancient and empty, like two deep wells that had long ago run dry. To look into them was to see a chilling void, a place where fear had gone to die. Jonas, for all his bluster, felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. He took an involuntary step back. "This ain't over, widow," he spat, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. He mounted his horse, gathered his men, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in his wake. Ilara rushed to Leo, brushing the dirt from his cheek, her hands trembling. Her son looked past her, his eyes wide, staring at the silent man by the barrel. Silas watched them for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking back to the forge, his limp a steady, receding beat. The silence he left behind was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Ilara made a decision. It was a fool's hope, a bargain with a ghost, but it was all she had left. She walked to the forge, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was standing by the cold hearth, his silhouette a study in stillness. She held out a loaf of bread and a canteen of water. "I don't have money," she began, her voice quiet but clear in the cavernous space. "But I have a barn. A roof. Food." Such as it is, she paused, gathering her courage. "You can work the forge. Keep what you earn from the town. In exchange, you stay. That's all. Just stay." He did not turn. He did not look at her. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the broken roof. She thought he would refuse, that he hadn't even heard her. She was about to turn away, the shame of her desperation hot on her cheeks, when he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of immense weight, a promise made without a sound. As he finally turned to take the bread, the fading light caught a thick, jagged scar that ran the length of his forearm, a pale, puckered map of some terrible history. Ilara looked from the scar to his eyes and understood. She had not just hired a blacksmith. She had made a pact with the silence, with the dust, and with the deep, abiding pain of a man who had nothing left to lose. The sound became the new rhythm of their lives, a metallic heartbeat against the vast, oppressive silence of the plains. Clang. Pause. Hiss. Clang. From the first blush of dawn until the last embers of twilight faded from the sky, the forge was alive. Silas worked with a devotion that bordered on penance. The fire in the great stone hearth was never allowed to die, its orange glow a defiant star against the encroaching darkness. He mended the broken things of redemption. A farmer's plowshare, worn to a sliver. A housewife's kettle, leaking its precious contents. A child's iron hoop, bent and useless. His hands, gnarled and crisscrossed with a road map of scars, moved with a surprising, almost delicate, precision. He would hold a piece of broken metal up to the light, his head tilted, his eyes seeing not what it was, but what it could be. Then he would turn to the fire and the anvil, and with sweat and smoke and the sheer force of his will, he would hammer it back into purpose. Ilara watched him from a distance. Each morning, she would leave a plate of food and a mug of coffee on the lip of the horse trough just outside the forge. For the first week, he would wait until she had retreated to the house before emerging from the shadows to retrieve it. He ate alone, a solitary figure dwarfed by the cavernous forge. Then, one morning, as she turned to leave, she heard the scrape of the plate. She looked back. He was standing in the doorway, the morning light behind him, and he ate as he watched her walk away. It was a small change, a barely perceptible shift in the landscape of their quiet arrangement, but it felt momentous. It felt like trust. She began to see the man behind the silence. She saw the deep, abiding exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. She saw the way his hand would sometimes drift to his hip, where a gun might have once rested, a phantom limb of a former life. She saw the way his eyes, so often vacant, would follow her children as they played in the yard, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, a sorrow, a longing, a fear. He never spoke to them. He never approached them. But he was always aware of where they were. Maya, too young to understand the complex language of adult caution, was the first to breach the wall of his solitude. One afternoon, she toddled over to the forge, clutching a bright yellow wildflower she had found growing defiantly by the creek bed. She stood at the great, open door, a tiny figure in a sun-faded dress, and held it out to him. Silas froze, his hammer held aloft over a glowing piece of iron. He stared at the flower, then at the child, as if she were an apparition. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the hammer. He wiped his hand on his leather apron, a gesture of almost reverent cleansing, and walked to the door. He knelt, his bad leg protesting, until he was at her eye level. He did not take the flower. He simply looked at it in her small hand. Maya, unafraid, placed the flower on the dusty threshold and scampered away. Later that day, when Ilara brought him his evening meal, she saw the wildflower. It was sitting in a cup of water on the stone ledge above the hearth, a tiny spot of vibrant color in a world of gray and black. Leo was warier. He saw Silas not as a guardian, but as an interloper in the space his father had once occupied. He missed the familiar weight of his father's presence, the sound of his laughter. Silas's silence was a constant, heavy reminder of his loss. Yet, the boy was drawn to the forge, to the elemental magic of fire and steel. He would perch on the fence rail a safe distance away and watch for hours as Silas worked. He watched the bellows breathe life into the coals, watched the iron glow from angry red to blinding white, watched the shower of sparks as the hammer fell. He was mesmerized by the transformation, by the way this quiet, broken man could command the most stubborn elements and bend them to his will. He was witnessing a power he didn't understand, and it both frightened and fascinated him. The fragile piece of their cohabitation was tested when the main axle on their wagon snapped. It was an old injury, patched and repatched, but this time it was a final, shearing break. The wagon was their lifeline, their only way to get grain to the mill or supplies from town. Staring at the splintered wood and twisted iron, Ilara felt a familiar despair wash over her. It was too much. The debt, the drought, and now this. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, bitter tears. She did not hear Silas approach. She only knew he was there when a shadow fell over her. She looked up. He was staring at the broken axle, his brow furrowed in concentration. Without a word, he set to work. He used the farm's mule to drag the wreckage to the forge. All that day and deep into the night, the hammer rang without pause. It was a relentless, driving rhythm, a furious assault on the forces of decay. Ilara lay in her bed, listening to the sound, and for the first time in a year, it was not the sound of loneliness, but of a fight being waged on her behalf. When she woke, the world was silent. A deep, pre-dawn quiet had settled over the farm. Fearing the silence more than the noise, she pulled on a shawl and hurried outside. The forge was dark, the fire banked to a soft, pulsing glow. And there, beside the anvil, was Silas. He was slumped on a low stool, fast asleep, his head resting against the cold iron. A threadbare blanket he kept in the barn had fallen to the floor. The new axle, sleek and black and impossibly strong, lay cooling beside him. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over Ilara. It was more than gratitude. It was a profound, aching recognition of the goodness in this silent, wounded man. She went back to the house and returned with the quilt from her own bed, the one her grandmother had made. She gently draped it over his shoulders. He didn't stir. His face, in the soft glow of the embers, was younger, the lines of pain smoothed away by sleep. She allowed herself a moment to simply look at him, to see the guardian who had appeared from the dust. She returned to the house as the first hint of light touched the eastern sky. She didn't thank him. She knew words were not his currency. But when she came out later that morning, she found the old, squealing hinge on her front screen door, a sound that had grated on her nerves for years, had been replaced. It now swung open and shut with a soft, satisfying whisper. It was his reply. It was their language. And on the horizon, the dust of approaching riders signaled that their quiet world was about to be tested again. The whispers began with a traveling peddler, a man named Abernathy whose trade was in gossip as much as it was in pots and pans. He had pulled his cart into town for a day, setting up outside the saloon. When Silas walked past on a rare trip to the general store for blasting powder, Abernathy saw him. The peddler's jovial face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks as if he'd seen a specter from a campfire tale. His eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and awe, followed Silas down the dusty street. Later that afternoon, inside the saloon, his voice was a hushed, trembling thing that still managed to cut through the din of poker games and cheap whiskey. "That's him," he breathed to the bartender, who leaned in close. "I swear on my mother's grave. I was there. I was on that wagon train fleeing the fire at Miller's Creek. We were trapped. The Cutler boys were coming for us, all 20 of them." And then, he appeared. Abernathy's gaze was distant, seeing the past. He was just the blacksmith, a quiet fella who kept to himself. But he stood at the mouth of that pass. Alone. With just his forging hammer and a look in his eyes that could freeze hell over. For 2 days, he held them back. We could hear it, the screaming, the sound of that hammer, like God's own wrath. He saved us. The bartender stared, dumbfounded. They called him the Ghost of Widow's Pass. Said he vanished after. Wounded. Everyone thought he was dead. The story, once spoken aloud, took on a life of its own. It leapt from the saloon and scattered through the town like windblown seeds, taking root in the fertile soil of redemption's quiet desperation. Ilara heard it when she went to town for flour. She heard the change in the way people looked at her, the mix of pity and newfound respect. She heard the name, Widow's Pass, spoken in hushed tones by women clustered near the mercantile. When she saw Silas at the far end of the street, loading a sack of coal onto his shoulder, she saw him through new eyes. The limp was no longer just a limp, it was the price of valor. The scars on his arms were not just the marks of his trade, they were a testament to a battle she could barely imagine. The silence she had grown accustomed to was not the emptiness of a broken man, but the immense, crushing weight of a hero's burden. A new fear bloomed in her heart, a sharp, protective fear not of him, but for him. She now understood that he was not just hiding from the world, he was hiding from a legend he could not escape. Bartholomew Thorne heard the rumors, too. He sat in his richly appointed office, the only 2-story building in town, and listened to Jonas recount the peddler's tale. Thorne was a man who believed in ledgers and contracts, not legends. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. A man with a reputation like that, living on the very land he coveted, was a liability. A legend could give people hope, and hope was the one thing he could not control. Hope could make a downtrodden farmer refuse a final offer. Hope could make a beaten town push back. He needed to extinguish it. He needed to prove that the Ghost of Widow's Pass was just a man, and that any man could be broken. "He's protecting the widow," Thorne said, his voice a low, reptilian hiss. "So we remind her that she is not worth protecting." His eyes, small and cold, met Jonas's. "You and 5 men. Go to the farm. I don't want threats this time, Jonas. I want damage. I want fear." The 6 riders arrived just before noon. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, seemed to haze over, the sun's light turning thin and pale. Ilara was in the yard, hanging laundry, the clean white sheets a stark contrast to the riders' dusty malevolence. Silas was in the forge, the steady, rhythmic clang of his hammer was a comforting counterpoint to the pounding of her own heart. Jonas didn't bother with pleasantries. He and his men dismounted and walked directly to the new section of fence Silas had built just the week before. With methodical purpose, they began to tear it down, kicking the posts from their holes and tossing the rails aside like kindling. "Stop it!" Leo's voice was sharp, a cry of pure indignation. He ran toward them, his small body trembling with rage. "You can't do that." Jonas turned, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He had been waiting for this. He enjoyed breaking things, but he savored breaking spirits. "Can't I, boy?" He took a step toward Leo. "This land belongs to Mr. Thorne. Or it will soon enough. We can do whatever we please." He raised his hand, intending to cuff the boy again, to humiliate him in front of his mother and the silent man in the forge. In that instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died. The birds fell silent. And from the forge, the rhythmic clang of the hammer ceased. The abrupt silence was more jarring than any sound. Every head turned toward the dark, gaping doorway of the smithy. Silas emerged, wiping his soot-stained hands on a damp rag. He moved with a terrifying calm, his limp barely noticeable. Each step was measured, deliberate. There was no rage on his face, no fury in his eyes. There was only a profound and absolute stillness, the unnerving calm at the center of a cyclone. He walked past the thugs as if they were nothing more than sagebrush. He went directly to Leo and knelt, placing a large, warm hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at the mark already forming on Leo's cheek from the last time, then he slowly stood and faced Jonas. For the first time since he had arrived, Silas spoke. His voice was not what Ilara had imagined. It was deeper, rougher, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river, a sound that had been held in reserve for a lifetime. It was a voice of pure, unyielding gravity. "Leave. Now." The words were not a request. They were a command. They were a boundary line drawn in the dust, a final warning before the breaking of a storm that had been gathering for years. Jonas, caught off guard by the voice, recovered with a nervous snort of laughter. It was a brittle, hollow sound. "Or what, Smith?" he sneered, trying to reclaim his dominance. "You gonna shoe my horse for free?" He took a swaggering step forward, his hand raised to shove Silas back, to reassert the familiar order of brute force. "You think a few words are gonna scare me?" He lunged, a clumsy, telegraphed motion born of arrogance. The movement that followed was not of this world. It was not the desperate scramble of a farmer or the wild swing of a drunk. It was a fluid, brutal geometry. Silas didn't retreat. He flowed into the attack. His left hand came up, not to block the shove, but to catch Jonas's wrist, his fingers locking on with the strength of an iron clamp. In the same motion, his body pivoted. He used Jonas's own momentum against him, turning, twisting. There was a sickening, wet pop, a sound of cartilage and bone surrendering. Jonas let out a strangled cry, his face contorting in a mask of agony and disbelief. His arm was bent at an angle it was never meant to take. Silas completed the movement with a short, sharp strike to Jonas's collarbone using the heel of his other hand. It was not a punch. It was a precise, calculated impact. Jonas collapsed into the dust, gasping for air like a landed fish, his good hand clutching his shattered arm. The other 5 thugs were frozen. They had come expecting to bully a widow and tear down a fence. They were now faced with something they could not comprehend. This wasn't a fight. This was a dismantling. The silent, limping blacksmith had taken apart their leader in less time than it takes to draw a breath, and he had done so with a chilling, surgical efficiency. Silas stood over the whimpering man on the ground. The haunted, vacant look in his eyes was gone, burned away by a cold, hard fire. It was the look of a man who had visited hell and knew its geography intimately. He looked at the remaining thugs, his gaze sweeping over them, pinning each one in turn. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower, quieter, yet it carried across the yard with the finality of a spadeful of dirt on a coffin lid. "I told you to leave." It was all that was needed. The spell of their shock broke, replaced by a primal, scrambling fear. Two of them rushed forward, not to fight, but to haul their broken leader to his feet. They half-dragged, half-carried the groaning Jonas to his horse, threw him over the saddle like a sack of grain, and fled. The others followed suit, spurring their horses into a panic gallop, not daring to look back. They disappeared down the road, leaving behind only a trail of dust and a profound, ringing silence. The farm was still. Ilara rushed to Leo, pulling him into a fierce embrace, her own body trembling. The boy wasn't crying. He was staring, his eyes wide with a terrifying wonder, at Silas. Silas, for his part, was not looking at the fleeing riders. He was staring down at his own hands. He held them up, turning them over and over, as if they belonged to a stranger. The calloused, scarred hands of a smith, the hands that could mend and create, were also the hands that could break and destroy. The violence, swift and final, had torn open a door he had kept bolted for years, and the ghosts of Widow's Pass were rushing in. With a visible effort, he mastered himself. The cold fire in his eyes receded, replaced once more by the familiar, banked embers of his grief. He turned without a word and walked back into the sanctuary of his forge, the heavy silence descending around him once more. That night, sleep was a stranger to the farmhouse. Ilara lay awake, the image of Silas's brutal efficiency replaying in her mind. It was not the violence that kept her awake, but the terrible calm with which he had delivered it. It was the calm of a man long past anger, a man who dealt in consequences. Finally, unable to bear the confines of the house, she rose. The moon was high and bright, casting the farm in shades of silver and black. She went to the barn, her bare feet silent on the cool earth. A soft, orange glow emanated from the forge. He was awake. He sat on the low stool by the hearth, not working, just staring into the dying coals, the great hammer resting by his side. He was a king in exile, brooding over a broken kingdom. She approached quietly, carrying a dipper of cool water. He looked up as she entered, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. She handed him the dipper. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through them both. She sat on an overturned bucket a few feet away, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. "They'll be back," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He took a long drink of water before answering, the sound of his swallowing loud in the stillness. He gave a slight nod. "I know. Thorn won't let this go." Another nod. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was a space for truth. She had to ask. She had to know the man who was guarding her family. "The story," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The one the peddler told. About Widow's Pass. Is it true?" He did not answer for a long time. He set the dipper down and stared into the glowing heart of the fire, his gaze lost in the shifting embers. He saw another fire, another place. He heard the screams. He felt the heat. When he finally looked at her, the mask of the stoic was gone. The pain in his eyes was raw, unguarded, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. His voice, when it came, was thick with unshed grief. "I failed them." The words were heavy, each one a stone on his soul. Ilara's heart ached for him. "The story says you saved them," she insisted gently. "You saved all those families." "Not all of them," he rasped. And the story came pouring out, not in a flood, but in broken, painful fragments. He had been the blacksmith for a wagon train, hired on as a guard for his size and strength. He was quiet then, too. Always quiet. When the Cutler gang attacked, everything was chaos and fire. He had been tasked specifically with protecting one family, a mother, a father, and their two small children, a boy and a girl. The same as her family. The father fell in the first volley. Silas had gotten the woman and her children and was trying to lead them through the canyon to safety while he held the pass. He stood his ground. He fought. He became the legend. But in the fury and the smoke, a stray bullet had found the mother. He'd held her as she died, her last words a plea for him to save her children. He had. He got them to the next town, left them with the church, and then he had simply walked away, the ghost of his failure chasing him. The jagged scar on his arm was from a knife in that fight. The deeper scars, the ones on his soul, were from the promise he felt he had broken. He fell silent, the confession leaving him hollowed out. Ilara looked at this powerful man, so utterly broken by his own honor. She saw it all now, his protection of Leo, his gentleness with Maya, his fierce defense of her and her home. It was all atonement. An act of penance for a sin he had never committed. She moved from the bucket and knelt before him in the dirt and soot of the forge floor. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid her fingers gently over the puckered scar on his forearm. His skin was warm. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. "You didn't fail, Silas," she said, her voice soft but imbued with an unshakable conviction. "You fought for them. You saved those children. And you are not failing us." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers. In her eyes, he did not see pity or fear. He saw understanding. He saw acceptance. He saw absolution. In that moment, something inside him that had been frozen for years began to thaw. The pact made in silence had finally been given a voice. The debt he felt he owed was not to the dead, but to the living. He would not run again. This time, he would not be a ghost in the pass. He would be a guardian at the gate. Word of Jonas's humiliation spread faster than a prairie fire. It reached Bartholomew Thorne not as a rumor, but as an undeniable fact, delivered by the shamefaced thugs who had fled the farm. Thorne, sitting behind his large mahogany desk, listened in icy silence. The legend of Widow's Pass was no longer a quaint campfire story, it was a clear and present danger to his authority. This silent blacksmith had not only defied him but had done so with an efficiency that exposed Thorne's hired muscle as the brutish incompetents they were. Humiliation curdled into a cold, venomous rage. This was no longer about a single plot of land. It was about crushing a symbol. He would not just defeat the man, he would erase the legend. He would make an example so brutal, so final, that the name Silas would be remembered only as a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to dream of defiance. He pushed back his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the town that he owned in all but name. "Gather every man on the payroll," he commanded to his subordinate. "Men from the lumber camp, the South Ranch, everyone. We are not going back there to tear down a fence. We are going to burn that farm to the ground and salt the earth. And we are going to do it where the whole town can see." The air in Redemption grew thick with a tense, fearful anticipation. People saw Thorne's men gathering, saw the extra rifles being cleaned, the torches being prepared. Fear, a far more familiar emotion than hope, settled over the town like a shroud. Doors were barred, shutters were drawn. The townsfolk, who had for a fleeting moment felt a flicker of inspiration, retreated into their cowardice. They would watch, as they always did, from behind their curtains, silent witnesses to the coming storm. On the farm, the world was deceptively calm. A strange, heavy peace had settled in the wake of Silas's confession. The truth, once spoken, had cleared the air between them. Ilara moved with a quiet purpose, securing the animals in the barn, bringing extra water into the house. Leo, his earlier resentment replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty, helped his mother without complaint, his eyes constantly straying toward the forge. Inside the small farmhouse, Maya played with a set of wooden blocks Silas had carved for her, oblivious to the gathering darkness. They were a family, bracing for a siege. Silas was not bracing. He was preparing. He did not build barricades of wood or stone. He was a smith, a master of iron and fire, and he would fight with the tools of his trade. He spent the day in the forge, the clang of the hammer ringing with a new, deliberate intensity. He wasn't mending things now, he was reforging them into weapons. He sharpened the blades of scythes until they gleamed like razors. He heated and twisted heavy lengths of chain, their links glowing a malevolent orange in the gloom. He laid out his hammers, the heavy sledge, the precise ball peen, the great forging hammer that felt like an extension of his own arm, placing them at strategic points around the farmyard. He was not building a fortress, he was turning the entire farm into a weapon, a landscape of deadly purpose that he knew better than any man alive. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, they came. Nearly 20 men, a mounted posse of thugs and hired hands, led by Thorn himself. They carried torches, the flames dancing and spitting in the twilight, casting long, monstrous shadows that stretched before them. They rode with the swagger of a conquering army, expecting to overwhelm a single man and terrorize a helpless family. They crested the rise and saw him. He was standing in the middle of the yard, alone, the forge glowing behind him like the mouth of a volcano. He was not holding a rifle. His hands were empty. He was simply waiting. Thorn reined in his horse. "Silas," he bellowed, his voice dripping with theatrical command. "Your foolish stand ends tonight. This land is mine. Surrender now, and I might let the woman and her children walk away." Silas did not answer. He simply watched them, his eyes calm, his body poised. Thorn sneered. "Have it your way. Burn it." The riders charged, whooping and yelling, their torches held high. They expected him to run, to be consumed by their numbers. But he did not run. He moved. As the first riders entered the yard, he melted into the shadows between the house and the barn. A rope he had strung at knee-height sent the first 2 horses tumbling, their riders thrown heavily to the ground. Before they could recover, Silas was on them, moving with that same impossible speed. He did not kill. He disabled. A blow from a hammer handle to a kneecap. A twist of a wrist that sent a rifle spinning into the darkness. He flowed through the chaos like a phantom, using the very layout of the farm as his ally. He lured a group toward the side of the barn, then sent a precariously balanced stack of hay bales toppling down on them. Men expecting a gunfight found themselves in a maelstrom of calculated, brutal kinetics. He appeared from the blinding light of the forge, swinging a heated chain in a whistling arc that cleared a half-dozen men from their saddles, their clothes smoldering, their skin screaming at the searing touch. It was Widow's Pass again, but different. This was not a desperate, lonely defense. This was a righteous, focused reclamation. He was not just protecting strangers, he was defending his home. From the windows of the town, the people of Redemption watched the unfolding drama. They saw the chaos, the scattered torches, the riderless horses. They saw one man moving through the fire and shadow, a force of nature against a tide of men. And shame, hot and sharp, began to pierce their fear. Old Man Hemlock, who had lost his own farm to Thorn years ago, was the first. He lit a lantern, took his old hunting rifle from the wall, and stepped out onto his porch. His neighbor saw him and did the same. One by one, lights began to appear. A small group of men and women, armed with lanterns and courage, began the slow walk up the hill toward the farm. They didn't come to fight. They came to stand. To bear witness. Their presence was a silent declaration, this was their town, too. Silas, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body bruised and aching, finally cornered Thorn near the water trough. The land baron, his posse scattered and broken, was alone, his face pale with terror. He fumbled inside his coat and pulled out a small, ornate pistol, his hand trembling. "Stay back," he shrieked. Silas didn't even slow down. With a contemptuous flick of his wrist, he struck the gun, sending it clattering into the darkness. He grabbed Thorn by the front of his expensive coat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. The immense, crushing strength in his hands was a silent promise of the annihilation he could unleash. Thorn whimpered, his arrogance finally shattered. "This is her home," Silas said, his voice quiet, yet carrying the weight of an earthquake. He brought the terrified man face to face. "This is their land. You will not return." He shoved Thorn backward, sending him sprawling in the mud. The land baron scrambled to his feet and fled into the night, his defeated men crawling out of the shadows to follow him. As the last of them disappeared, a profound quiet fell. The sun was rising, its clean light washing over the farm, revealing the debris of the fight but no lasting ruin. The lanterns of the townsfolk formed a silent, respectful perimeter. Ilara came out of the house, Leo and Maya holding tight to her hands. She walked across the yard, her eyes never leaving Silas. He stood there, weary, covered in dirt and sweat, but he was whole. And for the first time, the haunted, hunted look was gone from his eyes. In its place was a deep, quiet peace. He had faced his ghosts and laid them to rest, not in a lonely pass, but in the defense of a family. His gaze fell to his forging hammer lying on the ground. It was the symbol of his burden, his weapon, his penance. He bent to retrieve it. But before his fingers could close around the worn wooden handle, Ilara's hand covered his. He stopped, looking at her hand, then up into her eyes. "Come inside, Silas," she said, her voice soft. "Breakfast is ready." It was not a command or a request. It was an invitation. To a meal. To a morning. To a life. He looked from her face to the children standing behind her, watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. He looked at the small farmhouse, its windows golden with the morning light. He looked at the ring of neighbors, their lanterns held aloft like stars that had refused to fade. A life was being offered to him, one built not of iron and fire, but of warmth and acceptance. Slowly, he straightened up, leaving the hammer where it lay in the dirt. A small, unpracticed smile touched his lips, a genuine expression of a peace he had never thought he would find. He let her lead him toward the house, his limp seeming less a mark of injury and more a part of the steady, unwavering rhythm of a man finally walking home. The legend of the ghost of Widow's Pass was over. The story of Silas, the blacksmith, the husband, the father, was just beginning.